here from Quinn Dunki on picking apart the 2C Plus ROM. Thanks, Quinn.
Thank you. Is this thing on? Oh, all right. A little bit. Okay. Closer. How's that? You guys hear me okay? Yep. All right. I'm sorry for that. Yeah, that took you a second. All right. So this is spelunking the 2C Plus ROM. And so my project this year was to dig into the 2C Plus because I felt like it was a machine that a lot of us love and not a lot is known about. And as great as a machine as it is, it has a couple of obnoxious quirks that a lot of us know about. So yeah, the ultimate goal of this year was to produce these guys, which some of which are now on the floor. But action shot. Hold on. So as I think you all probably know by now from my shameless self-promotion, I am selling these ROMs at the vendor fair this year, some of which are now discounted. Rest assured, these are the spares. So in a nutshell, these guys are, it's the 2C Plus ROM with what's what I call my mega beep ROM. It changes the beep sound to sound more like the original Apple II beep, as close as I could get it. I'm not a musician, so my ear might not be perfect, but I tried to get it as close as I could, which turns out to be a little trickier than it sounds. I know you're all thinking, why didn't you just copy the code? More on that later. And also defaults the accelerator to 1 megahertz, because a 4 megahertz default made a lot of sense in 1987 when you were running AppleWorks most of the time. It's extremely annoying when now if I'm running on real hardware, odds are I just want to play Load Runner and have some chance at success. So defaults to 1 megahertz, and you can still do the escape trick to get back to 4 megahertz. So how did I get to that point? Well, let's find out. All right, so why did I want to drill into the 2C Plus ROM? Well, I think you know why. Of course, anyone who's turned on a 2C Plus knows that beep. It's just wrong, right? And as I just said, 4 megahertz seemed like a really great idea at the time. Now it's really annoying. It's 3 megahertz too many for every game ever made for the Apple II. So how to get started with this process? Well, so step one was to get the bytes out of the ROM. I looked for dumps of the 2C Plus ROM and couldn't find any. Turns out later there were some out there at the time. They were not in any of the usual places, and my Google foo failed to find any of them. So it did exist before this, but I couldn't find one. So I had to figure out how to get the bytes out of the ROM myself. Second problem here is that there were no known emulators of the 2C Plus. Apparently, as I learned yesterday from Mr. Scott, MAME may or may not do this in some capacity. I was not aware of that at the time, but could not find an emulator that did the 2C Plus either. So what I ended up doing was building my own ROM dumping tool, which you can see there. I am very cheap, and so I did not want to buy one. And reading a 1987 ROM is just about one of the easiest microcontroller projects you can do. You apply power to the ROM, you apply 1s and 0s to the address lines, and 1s and 0s appear on the data lines, and you have a byte of that ROM. Repeat 32,768 times, and you have a dump. It is really that easy. So, and with modern microcontrollers like the one that I used here, which is the 18Mega 32UA, it has USB right on that little chip. That little chip, by the way, is about half the size of my pinky fingernail. That shot is through a high power lens, so that soldering was not easy, but yeah, these chips are so easy to use. They come with USB, support right on the chip, and so you can connect it to your hardware or to your Mac and through USB and download the bytes, and it's not that difficult. So more details on that project are on my blog, which I will link to later. Blondie Hacks, which some of you might remember or might be readers of. And Don't worry, there will be many, many shameless plugs of that blog later in this talk. So, did all that, got some bytes. Seems legit, they're bytes, right? Yay for bytes. So, but there's this chicken and egg problem, right? When you're dumping a previously unknown ROM, how do you know if it's right? You don't have anything to compare it to, so the bytes might be wrong, and if they are, where's the problem? Is it in your tool? Is it in the way that you're examining the results? You can't even know if what you're looking at is correct. But it seems legit because this is the very end of my dump, and you can see those 3 vectors there, which if you know your 6502, you recognize those as your, interrupt, restart, and NMI, or whatever the 3 vectors are at the end of a 6502 ROM. So that was encouraging. Okay, so we've got our bytes out. My ultimate goal, though, of course, is to modify this and make changes to the ROM. So we need a way to get bytes back in. So I took that microcontroller that you saw earlier, and I modified it into an EEPROM burner. Both because I want to be able to modify this ROM, and also because a good way to know if your bytes are right are to reburn them and see if the machine boots. So, expanded my tool into a roughly full-blown thing. If you want one of these guys, the Gerbers and everything are all on my blog, so feel free to make your own. It's fun.
Vendor fair.
Yeah, one of my goals for this year was to develop this into a product that you could all buy. That is so much more work than you think it's going to be when you start something like this, as Mr. Mangan knows well. That didn't happen this year. I've built 3 of them, and I exchanged one for an Ethernet card, so there are 2 of these in the wild. That may still happen, we'll see. If there's demand for this thing. It's very primitive. It only knows how to dump one size of ROM right now, and yada, yada, yada. There are really great ROM dumping tools out there, so there are better ones than this, but none of them have Mac support, which is annoying, so you end up running their tools, which were probably written in 1993 in VirtualBox or something to get them to work on a Mac. But yeah, if there's interest in this, let me know, and I might continue developing it. All right, so I can make EEPROMs now. Still seems pretty legit, despite the appearance there. So for anyone who doesn't know, there's two major kinds of writable ROMs, right? There's EPROMs and EEPROMs. Mostly what you find in this old hardware are EPROMs, which are the ones with the little glass window on them, which is not for snooping on the bits, it's for erasing them. And nowadays we use what are called EEPROMs. So EPROM is erasable programmable read-only memory. EEPROM is electrically erasable programmable read-only memory. It's a mouthful. So EPROMs you erase with UV light through that adorable window. And what's interesting about them is that the UV light sets all the bits, I think. The electrically programmable part of it, you can only set bits to 0, and the UV light sets them all to 1. So you actually set them all and then erase a couple. That's how you program them. They're kind of neat. Nowadays we use EEPROMs, which are basically like flash memory. You can pretty much just read and write to them. So they're really slick. Easy to program with a microcontroller again. The trick is EEPROMs have different pin layouts than EPROMs. So if you want to put an EEPROM in your 2C Plus, as shown here, you need to remap those pins. In fact, I have that prototype here. So you can make a little socket that just moves a couple of the pins around to make it compatible. So I also have these boards if anyone wants those. If you want to put an EEPROM in your Apple II, let me know. These files are also on my site, and I made a half dozen of these little boards if anyone wants one. Still seems legit. I got my little remap socket for my EEPROM, turn it on, and it booted. So yay, well, eventually it booted. It took a lot of trial and error. Turns out getting bytes out of the ROM and over the serial port to the USB flawlessly is a little harder than it seems. It's easy to miss a byte somewhere in the middle and not know it. So it took some tries to get it right. And luckily at this point, someone, probably Antoine Vigneault, sent me a dump of the 2C Plus ROM. So after a few months of developing my tool to dump the ROM, turns out the dump did exist. So the nice thing, though, is I was able to compare it and confirm when my tool was working. All right, so point of all that is we want to fix the beep, right? That maddening, maddening beep. So where is the beep? Right? No? 80s children? Give me some love? All right. Where is the beep? So the thing about the 2C Plus is that it is the only 8-bit Apple II that did not have complete source code ROM listings in the manual or in the technical reference manual. So the 2C Plus marked Apple's shift from computers as programmers' tools to computers as appliances that run applications. And so the documentation for the 2C Plus, which is in the 2nd edition technical reference manual, which is on archive.org, it only has sort of these API style of documentation for the calls. So these are ROM entry points, just like they always have been, but they've documented them in the style of API calls, using registers as parameters and so on. It's adorable. They're trying to be all grown up here. But of course, it's just ROM entry points, and they've chosen not to give us the code for them. So the code is not documented, but the 2C is fairly close, so it's kind of a decent starting point. And we know from the docs that FF3A is where the bell is on the 2C Plus. Well, sort of, right? Because if you've ever looked at that code, you know that there's actually 3 bells. So one of those 3 might be the one that you're used to calling. They're all slightly different. One of them has a 0.1 second delay in front of it. One doesn't. So there's variations of them. But luckily, those 3 versions of the bell call all fall through to the same core routine because was, right? So he wrote it. That code is incredibly compact, and as I'm sure any of you know who've looked at it, almost everything falls through to something else. So there's a lot of reuse in there, which is nice for us because we only have to make our hacks in one place. So if you dig in there, you find that the FBDD version of that function is like the one that all the others fall through into. So we just need to hack that. So there's a Huckleberry there. That disassembly is from DCC6502, which is a pretty nice 6502 disassembler. It shows address labels and some other nice things. It doesn't know about 65C02 instructions, but still, it's pretty useful for this. So there's our beep code. You might recognize that there's an inner loop and an outer loop, and some JSRs to FCA8, which I'll get into in a minute. But wait a minute. Why is there a B in front of that? Well, of course, it took me an alarming amount of time that I'm not proud of to realize this, that the ROM is 32K, and there's only 16K of address space for the ROM in the 2C Plus. So, of course, it's bank switched, right? The 2C ROMs have been bank switched since the tail end of the 2C and into the 2C Plus. They went to a 32K ROM. Most of it is pointless diagnostics. There's some Unidisc or 3.5-inch disc stuff in there, whatever. A lot of code. And if you can tell how new the code is in that ROM by how poorly written it is. It gets worse and worse as time goes on. As we'll see in a minute, the beep code was clearly written by an intern or something, because it's a pale shadow of some of the early 2 Plus ROM code, which is really tight and really nice. However, eventually I did figure out that, oh, okay, this is all in the wrong place because it's being bank switched, and in the case of the bell is actually living in a bank switched area. So, well, it's in an unbank switched area, which is why the addresses are all off by 16K. So, of course, another way to do this, rather than going through all this rigmarole with the disassembly, is to just boot the machine and go into the monitor and look at it, right? You can do that to a point. You can look at a lot of the ROM code in the monitor right on the machine itself. You cannot do that with the bank switched areas, and it's very tricky about that. There are areas of the bank switched ROM that it will show you as though they are not bank switched, and areas that it won't. So there are parts of the code I ended up writing that are completely invisible on the machine. There is no way to look at them because the monitor prevents you from flipping certain switches and things to look at other banks. You could write code to do it, but you can't do it in the monitor itself. It's pretty interesting.
Could you write code to switch copy into
Yes, exactly. That's what I mean. You could write some code to dump that code into a place that you can see. But yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting that there are areas of the ROM that are actually invisible. And you know, even if you like do something like in the monitor, write to that soft switch and then do the list and then set the switch back or something like that, it still doesn't work. It just doesn't let you touch some of those things. So anyway, so this here is the Apple IIc version of the beep code. Life was very simple in 1984. It's an inner loop and an outer loop, and it just counts and it flicks the speaker, and that's it. Now,
the same beep code since 1977.
yes, exactly. So what you're actually looking at here is the what's called the ROMWait function. Okay, so this is FCA8. This is that thing that was being JSR'd to in the middle of the beep code. So the beep code is flicking the speaker, waiting a little bit, and looping, right? And that waiting a little bit is this function here. So this is very well documented. There's even in the technical reference manual, there's a little formula explaining if you set the accumulator to this, you'll get this amount of approximate time. And it's great, and this works because it runs at 1 megahertz, so you can just measure time by counting clock cycles. And this code is, yeah, as I said, remained unchanged since like 1977. Woz wrote this himself. So life was very simple in 1984. In 1987, not so much. This is the IIc Plus's version of that same function. Now, this is where things get really interesting because now we have 1 megahertz and 4 megahertz, right? So it's like a loss of naivete. We can no longer count time by counting clock cycles because clock cycles are variable length now. So, or there's more of them in a given amount of time, I guess is a more accurate way to say that. So they needed to write a ROMWait function. Since ROMWait is this sort of standard way to measure a piece of time, they needed to modify it so that it would behave the same way at 1 megahertz and 4 megahertz, right? And this is all a unique problem to the IIc Plus because it's the only 8-bit that runs at 2 different clock speeds. So what's going on here? So quite a bit. The first thing you'll notice is that there's a block of nops at the top of the function. That's because this function lives in the other bank, so we get bank switched in here. So this lives on top of the old ROMWait function, so that's what the nops are there for. That's kind of overlaying the old wait function. So on the IIc Plus, it jumps there, flips the bank, and we jump into here, run through some nops, and then start doing the actual code. Then you'll see some bytes there where the disassembler got confused. This is a different disassembler now. This is DA65, the CC65 disassembler. It handles 65 CO2 stuff a little better, and it does really nice labels, as you can see there. It finds JSRs and converts them into labels, which is really nice. But it gets confused easily with byte offsets and instructions. So I use both disassemblers a lot. So there's some weird stuff going on in there, right? You would think it would be another pair of nested loops to count time. But the first highlighted area there is you'll see it loading 9A into Y and then loading accumulator with C000 off of Y and then transferring X into A. So it's doing a seemingly pointless indirect load and then immediately throwing away the results of that load. WTF, right? So the indirect access part is because this code is being shared by other areas. You'll see that DA65 has figured that out by putting in that FCBA label right above that load. That's because there's other code elsewhere in the ROM that reuses this trick. So that's why that's there. It allows other people to control which part of the hardware page they're using. So then the other interesting thing is, of course, the LDA. The core of this is that LDA, which effectively becomes an LDA of C09A, which is somewhere in the hardware page, right? And then throwing away the results. So if you dig into the second edition technical reference manual, I think in the first edition, this whole area of memory is just listed as reserved. But if you, I believe in the second edition, it's listed as the printer port ACIA command register. So for some reason, it's doing an LDA from that command register and then ignoring the result. Why would it do that, right? So the answer is this gnarly chip in the 2C Plus called the CGGA, which I was going to look up the name of and forget now. Something something gate array. The CGGA is the magic in the 2C Plus. It is what allows it to run at 4 megahertz and still access all the slots and still be compatible and everything. So the CGGA controls the accelerator and manages the CPU's access to the slots, so that, you know, because of course the disk 2 and everything still has to run at 1 megahertz, even while the CPU and the fast cache RAM are running at 4 megahertz. So CGGA is this very large, very complicated chip that is basically magic, basically undocumented, and does all of this. So one of the things the CGGA does is it looks for accesses to certain things to slow down the CPU. And one of those things is the printer port. So if you touch the printer port, try to send a command to it, it automatically slows down the CPU for 50 milliseconds to give that, whatever that command was, time to run at 1 megahertz. And then it resumes 4 megahertz after 50 milliseconds. So whatever intern wrote this piece of crap used that trick and to slow the machine down to 1 megahertz so that the subsequent cycle counting would be correct. So then you can go back to counting cycles to mark your time. So and in theory, it works the same at 1 or 4 megahertz. So the maddening thing is this is not actually necessary because, as I said, the CGGA watches for accesses to certain memory addresses, slows down the CPU for 50 milliseconds, and resumes. It does this for the printer port, does this for the disk port, also does that for the speaker, because otherwise audio would all be wrong, right? So they didn't even need to do this. I don't know. I guess the reason it's in here because this is a generic ROMWait function that's used by a lot of different pieces of code, and the new Bell code just happens to use this because it was there. So there's this unnecessary gymnastics to guarantee 1 megahertz so you can count cycles for the audio. So the moral of all this is don't mess with ROMWait. It's confusing, it's complicated, pieces of it are reused elsewhere. Lots of other functions depend on it. So if you're going to fix the beep, you don't want to try and change ROMWait because you're going to get in trouble in a hurry. So instead, so this what we're looking at here is the ROMWait function from the 2C. So I thought, well, okay, what I should do is just take this code, the timing code, and port it over to the 2C Plus somehow. So I disassembled it and I counted. There's cycle counts there, and you can see that for the accumulator is the parameter to this function, and at a value of for a equals 1, you get 22.4829 microseconds. So interestingly, the exact same routine, I did the same analysis on the 2C Plus version of it. For accumulator of 1, you get 33.9154 microseconds. So that's why the beep sounds different, because for the same input value, it behaves slightly differently. The reason is, so the 2C version as shown up there, you've got a 5-cycle inner loop, a 12-cycle outer loop, and 8 cycles of overhead. The 2C Plus version is slightly different. I think the inner loop is 11 cycles, and there's 30 cycles of overhead. So basically that means the longer, the shorter the delay you're asking for, the larger the error is. So on longer things like disk accesses or serial activity, this difference is insignificant. On very short delays like you would use in audio, then you start to see the errors. So that's why the beep sounds different. So if there's some music code out there that also uses ROMWait, it would also sound weird. But I don't think anyone really used this function except Apple. All right, so clearly the best way to do this is to write my own beat and just put it in there and leave everything else alone. Yes?
You want to wait until after you're done?
Yeah, I'm a little tight on time, so let me jam through this, and then I'll take your heckling at the end, which I'm sure will be insightful. So where to put this ROM code. So the beep code lives in bank 0, which is the unswitched bank, the normal one. What you're seeing here is the disassembly of the beep code and the surrounding area. And all of bank 0 looks like this. It is absolutely packed. There is not a free byte in that entire bank. Okay, so we can't patch our beep code over top of the existing stuff because it's just too full. There's no room. So this is going to get messy. Here's a very quick guide to patching the 2C Plus ROM. Step 1, find a hole in bank 0 that lines up with a hole in bank 1, because you need to put your code in bank 1, and you need to be able to jump into a hole in bank 0 that is in the same place and switch it. Now you're magically teleported into bank 1, and your code will run. Okay? So you write your code in that hole with bank switches on either side. Then you patch the original code to jump to that hole and switch the banks, and you're done, right? Easy peasy. Now sometimes there isn't a hole big enough in both banks to do this, to hold whatever code you want to write, so then you have to cry. There was lots of tears. Then you gather yourself up and you kick the dog and whatever you need to do. And well, my dog is stuffed, so I don't feel too bad. Yeah, I'm not a monster. So this is going to get messier if your code doesn't fit. So for example, for my beep code, I was able to actually do it the easier way. But for the accelerator control step, I needed quite a bit more code and had to get a lot more creative. So patching the 2C Plus ROM Advanced Edition. You find a hole in bank 1 that lines up with a hole in bank 0. So far, so good. Then find a big hole in bank 1 that will hold your code. Jump to the other bank using the small hole, and then jump to the big hole from the small hole. Run your code, jump back to the small hole, flip the bank, and return. So you got to do this little leapfrogging thing back and forth through memory. So you have to have matching holes in both banks to switch. So you have to basically get into that matching hole and then jump away, do whatever you want, jump back, and then switch back, right? So, so this is Beep 2.0 using the relatively easy earlier method. And I won't go into gory details here, but basically what I ended up doing was copying the Apple IIc's ROMWait code into a hole in bank 1 and wrote basically a copy of the beep code that used my new version of the ROMWait, which is the same as the old one. And I didn't have to do all that rigmarole with the printer port because, again, just touching the speaker will slow down the CPU for you. So it's a little bit non-deterministic because the CGGA is running, you know, quantum magic happening, and that 50 millisecond deceleration effect is, you know, it's not exactly clear when and how that happens. So it's hard to get this to sound exactly right. Even running the exact same code, it may sound a little bit different because there's that CGGA hardware effect. But I think it's very, very close. So there's a lot more. I only had 30 minutes to cram this into, so I glossed over a lot of details. There are a lot of clever tricks in this ROM code that I would love to talk more about, but I don't have time. So much of it is detailed in all the gory detail you want on my blog, which is there. And you should, what happened there? And you should find me at the vendor fair to buy a Megabeep ROM because you know you want to. I have time for hopefully a couple of fast questions. Yes?
Rather than, as you point out, maybe they didn't have to like write new code at all, but in as much as they did so, would it have made more sense for them to have just had an alternate code if you were running at 4 megahertz that counted 4 times as many cycles rather than one general purpose code that does it wrong?
Yes, that would have made a tremendous amount of sense. Okay. Hence my earlier comment regarding interns. Yeah, I have no idea why they did it this way. It seems I can think of 3 better ways to do it without breaking a sweat. So.
It seems like a good hard coding situation.
Yeah, and there's plenty of space in Bank 1. That's the funny thing. You know, Bank 1 is 16K. It's probably got 12K of code in it. There's tons of room in there where they could have done things like write 2 complete copies of the beep code or write 2 complete copies of ROMWait that for the 2 speeds. Like, there's so many better ways they could have done it. And the fact that they just did it this way was the least amount of new code, basically. This way reuses the most amount of code, which to me says they were just trying to knock it out and get it done and not worry about exactly correct behavior. So yeah, that's it's a big difference from the old ROM code. Yeah.
If you can expound on this, I'd like to know if somebody wanted to follow the process just to do it, what kind of skills would be necessary?
None really. I mean, so the 2C Plus ROM is now out there. I don't know how that happened. Could have been anyone really, but it's so you can find the ROM on archive.org and various other places.
Well, I mean, for the nuts, I mean, going through dumping the ROM.
Well, I mean, step 1, read my blog. Step 2, do the stuff I said in my blog.
So it's all.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason for going through all this trouble was that I wanted to learn the process. So I did want to actually build a device that would dump ROMs, because that seemed like a perverse sort of fun to me. So, and it's a good exercise with a microcontroller. You could do this with an Arduino, you could do it with a PIC, you could do it with any sort of microcontroller. It's a very easy exercise to do. So, yeah, I mean, skills-wise, not much more than, the blinking an LED with an Arduino. 1987 ROMs are incredibly easy to read. There's no encryption, there's no handshaking, there's no protocols. You ask for an address, you get the data, rinse, repeat. And then yeah, the rest of the software side is just disassembly and tracing through the code and yada yada. There's lots of different ways to do it. I should point out that my accelerator hack is a little bit workaround, because the accelerator is tricky to interface with and doesn't always respond the way you expect it to. Maybe another time I'll do a whole talk on the accelerator modification code, which was a much bigger project. And within 5 minutes of releasing it, Antoine Vigneault showed me a better way to do it. So, there's always better ways and more ways to do it, but the exercise is kind of the point. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Plans to do full disassembly or continue on the path of at least modification?
Yeah, I mean, I have full disassemblies on my machine. I haven't gone through and traced it all and commented it all or anything. Yeah, there is a lot of it. Like the Unidisc driver in there is it's like 10K or something ridiculous. It's huge, and there's 12K of diagnostics or something. So yeah, it would be a massive exercise to document all of that, and not really worth the effort. So as for further changes, probably not. I feel like I fixed the 2 thorns in my side for the 2C Plus, and the beep and the accelerator default. Yeah. So probably not, but never say never. Yeah.
Is the code that's in the original 2C Plus ROM affected by the accelerated accelerators that you can get, Sean? They don't go up to 12 and 14 megahertz.
Right, that's an excellent question. I'm not 100% certain, but I believe my code should work fine with those, because those mods, I believe, change the crystal. And yeah, they maintain the 1 megahertz mode, I assume, right? Because there's two.
I trust your code to work.
Yeah.
My question was, is the original beep and wait code such that it isn't affected by 4 megahertz suddenly being 6.5 megahertz or 8 megahertz? That maybe that was why it wasn't just a wait code that was 4 times as long versus a wait code that was 1 time.
Are you suggesting that they were anticipating people accelerating it, or?
They weren't sure what was going to be accelerated.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, they might have been thinking, oh, let's just do this the most future-proof way possible, which is, the way they did it. So yeah, it's definitely possible. They may not have settled on the final speed yet, or, yeah.
But it's essentially unaffected by what the speed is.
Yeah. The advantage of the way they did it is that it is independent of clock speed completely, which is a very modern way to think about such a problem. So in that sense, it's kind of a coming of age for Apple in that. But yeah, it's completely clock speed independent, which is nice, but still, the beep is wrong. John?
Is your
Oh.
personal 2C Plus accelerating with dropless communication?
It is not. So I have not 100% confirmed that my mod works with the accelerator, but I believe it does because right there's 2 crystals, right, and that's how the mod works. Yeah. So then it's fine. Yeah, it will definitely work then. Yeah, John.
You had decided about don't messing with, not messing with ROMWait, but
Yeah.
it seems like ROMWait is kind of fairly broken. So is that something that you tried to fix or change or
Well,
fix or what happened there?
yeah, the reason I opted not to touch it is because it's used by a lot of other stuff in the ROM, and I sort of feel like they probably tested it all. I mean, there weren't widespread reports of serial printers not working or modems not working or other things like that that would show up if ROMWait was fundamentally broken. So I just erred on the side of being surgical and just not touching anything more than I needed to. The nice thing about this approach is that I know for sure I did not alter any other behavior besides just the beep. So yeah, that was my thought.
Yeah, and specifically, you know, on that ROMWait problem, so GS has the same issue, dual clocks, and also the GSOS copied ROMWait into the Apple driver, but then got a ROM in a similar kind of way.
Yeah.
So, you know, that was one of the other recently discovered bugs, I think, patches happened since 01. So, yeah, it's like ROMWait was something they really relied on lots of places and got wrong lots of times.
Yeah, and maybe hardware makers just compensated for that in their devices or something. Yeah, it's hard to say. Maybe they just put bigger error bars on everything. Who knows? But yeah, the ecosystem seemed to exist relatively well, despite that function being probably wrong. So I'm inclined to leave it alone. Yeah. Any other questions? I guess we're short on time, but yeah. All right. Thanks.